Selfies that were taken right before death, Part 1. In 2014, Oscar Reyes participated in the Selfie Olympics and took a photo of himself hanging from his bathroom door. A few seconds later, he slipped and fell, hitting his head on the toilet and dying from severe blood loss. Andrew Macaulay attempted to be the first man to kayak from Australia to New Zealand. He took this selfie and texted his family that he would be home soon, but drowned just 30 miles away from the finish line. In 2011, 3 teens in Utah took this selfie together on the train tracks. It appears to be a happy, ordinary photo, but the glare on the right side of the screen is from the train that runs into them just a few seconds later.
Have you ever wondered how accurate police sketches are? I'm going to show you a sketch, then I'm going to show you the person that was arrested, and we're going to see. So this is the police sketch for the man wanted in the Delphi murder case, one of the most high-profile unsolved murders right now. For those who don't know, in 2017, 2 young girls, Abby Williams and Libby German, were murdered while out for a walk in the woods. And a few days ago, this man, Richard M. Allen, was arrested as a suspect in the murders. And Richard looks so different from that sketch that here's actually a photo of him posing next to it, completely unnoticed. A better comparison would actually be this photo that one of the girls posted to Snapchat, where she was able to get video and audio of the man before they were murdered. Details pertaining to the arrest are still under wraps, but I could definitely see how that man would be this man, more so than the police sketch.
Normal-looking photos that have a disturbing backstory, Part 25. In 2012, a group of 10 travelers from New Zealand boarded a hot air balloon. But during the landing process, the balloon collided with the power line, causing it to erupt into flames, killing all 10 people and the pilot on board. This is the last photo ever taken of Kim Wall, a journalist who was stabbed 15 times by Danish inventor Peter Madsen after she boarded his homemade submarine to interview him. This image shows brothers Nick and Jack Savage taken just a few hours before their death. Their mother found them dead in their sleep after experimenting the previous night with opioids just a few days after their high school graduation. This photo of Bart and Kevin Whitaker was taken a few hours before a hitman that Bart had hired attempted to kill his entire family after they returned home from a graduation dinner. Sadly, his father was the only member of the family who survived. Notice Bart's hand.
This man has been sentenced to 100 years in prison after doing the unthinkable to his daughter. Tony Valles is a 66-year-old from Helena. On the 10th of July 2022, he was at home with his partner Heather. Tony's 8-year-old daughter Ariana and his 18-year-old son were also at the house at the time. Suddenly, 2 women entered the property who he believed were evicting him. He flew into a violent rage and grabbed a weapon from his bedroom. At this point, he began shooting. He shot Heather and she fell to the floor, and then he shot at his son. His 8-year-old daughter tried to escape and run from the terror, but she was hit with gunfire. She was on the stairs when she was hit by a bullet and she fell back. She tragically died after being rushed to hospital. After his daughter's death, Tony stated, "I'm sorry for all this. I can't undo what I've done. The pain and the misery will last a lifetime, and I'm sorry for all that." Tony was sentenced to serve 100 years in prison.
This is by far the worst love triangle story I've ever heard of. In September of 2020, 31-year-old Armando Barone murdered his wife's co-worker when he found out that she was having an affair with him. 25-year-old Jonathan Emerald and 33-year-old Brittany Barone worked together at a biomedical device company in New Hampshire. But on this specific day, Armando went through Brittany's phone and lost it when he discovered text messages between Brittany and Jonathan. He beat Brittany so bad that she passed out, but it doesn't end there, and let me warn you, it gets really disturbing. That night, after Armando threatened to take Brittany's life, he took her phone and texted Jonathan pretending to be her. He then lured Jonathan to a park where he shot him 3 times and then drove 200 miles to a campsite where he forced Brittany to decapitate his body. Armando ordered Brittany to bury Jonathan's head in the dirt and told her that once the sun came up the next morning, he would forgive her. He then left Brittany in the wooded area so that she can get rid of evidence, and 2 days later, officers found Brittany at the campsite, and that's when she confessed that something had happened. Brittany was sentenced to 3.5 to 7 years in prison on 3 counts of falsifying evidence, but she has been released. And Armando was sentenced to life in prison without parole.
My daughter gave birth to my 7 children. My name is Joseph Fritz, and this is my terrible story. I built a secret basement under my house in Austria. There, I locked up my own daughter Elizabeth for 24 long years. I was a manipulative, domineering father. No one could have guessed what was going on in that basement. I led a double life. A normal husband and father on the top floor and a monster in the secret basement. During the years I spent with that basement, I committed atrocities against my own daughter. Elizabeth had 7 children. 4 of them grew up with her in that secret basement, while the other 3 lived upstairs with my wife and me, unaware of the truth. But in 2008, everything changed. One of the girls was born in the basement because Austin became seriously ill. I had to take her to the hospital, but I didn't know that would be the beginning of my downfall. The doctors asked questions. The police and media began to investigate. My terrible secret was revealed. The basement in which I had locked my daughter and children was discovered. In 2009, I was sentenced to life imprisonment. I'm now behind bars where I can't do anything to anyone. My story has shocked the world, and many people wonder how such a crime could go unnoticed for so long.
More information has been released recently about the killing of 4 university students at the University of Idaho, but the killer is still at large. On Sunday morning, 4 students were found stabbed to death in their beds near campus. 2 other roommates were at home at the time upstairs, but both were unharmed. It's believed that their deaths occurred around 3 or 4 in the morning, though the 911 call was not placed until the following day. It's also now believed that they were asleep at the time of the attack. Initially, police believed that there was no further threat to the community, but they have since backtracked that. And as of now, they're looking for a K-Bar brand combat blade that they think was used in the attack. A live stream from a food truck actually shows Madison and Kaylee ordering food hours before the attack happened. In the video, this man can actually be seen behind the girls, walking around and looking at them, leading many internet sleuths to believe that he was somehow involved, but he has since been cleared by the police. Police have also released this updated timeline of events showing that Xana and Ethan were at a party and Maddie and Kaylee were getting food that night. A lot of this information has actually been uncovered by Kaylee's sister, who's taken a lot of the investigation into her own hands. And one thing that she wants people to know is that Kaylee called her ex-boyfriend 6 times that night, an hour before the attack happened. Right now, we don't know if that means anything, but it is something that she wanted out there. Classes have not been canceled on campus, but if you choose to not go, you will not be penalized. And if anyone has any tips or information on this case, you can call a tip line at 208-883-7180.
This is the tree video, one of the worst ISIS execution videos you should never go looking for, explained. The video that I'm about to explain is extremely brutal and I don't recommend looking it up. The victim in the video is apparently a US spy and he is wearing an orange jumpsuit like most victims are in ISIS videos. The video is about 40 seconds long and it begins with the victim standing up, but his arms have been chained to 2 trees which forces him to stand up with his arms stretched out. One of the ISIS members then reads a statement accusing the victim of being a spy. 2 young boys who look like teenagers can be seen standing behind the victim. The boys have their arms raised above their heads like they are about to swing something, and upon looking closer, you can see the 2 boys are about to swing swords. The video then shows the 2 boys swinging the swords at the same time, and they cut off the victim's outstretched arms. They managed to cut them off in one swing, but this could be due to editing because ISIS loves doing that. You then get a close-up shot of one of the older ISIS members slitting the victim's throat. The camera sits in a still shot and zooms into the victim's eyes as he is being beheaded. The video then jump cuts and it shows the victim's headless and armless corpse. It also shows the victim's severed arms hanging from the trees by the chains. The video then concludes as an even younger child who is no older than 9 reads out a statement with his foot on the victim's severed head, and this is where the video concludes. ISIS execution videos are extremely hard to watch and I don't recommend ever looking for them or this one. Please do yourself a favor and stay curious because this video is extremely brutal.
This former Disney music executive was charged with child sex abuse. This is John Healy himself, who's now in his 60s, and in 2017 he was charged with 3 felony counts of child sex abuse. All of this had happened apparently a decade ago. He was accused of abusing one girl when she was 15 years old and then targeting another 11-year-old girl and abusing her all the way up until she was 15. When he was arrested back in 2017, John's Twitter profile only read one thing: Disney concerts and living to glorify God in all things. Now, when all this happened back in 2017, I read that Disney terminated him immediately from his position. I mean, how could they not? These were some very graphic and disturbing allegations that were made against John. But if you go to his LinkedIn page and you scroll down a bit, it says that he still works at Disney. I don't know what that means, if it's true or not, but it's kind of strange. In fact, I can't even find anything about how this case was ended. Hold up, now this is interesting. So I just stopped and really dug into the research about this guy, and I found that they dropped the charges in 2019 because there was a hung jury. They couldn't reach a decision on whether or not he was actually guilty of these crimes or not. Apparently, according to this news article that I'm reading, the people involved in the case did not want the charges to be dropped, but his defense team argued that since it was the third trial that he was involved in, the case should be thrown out, and the judge complied and just threw all the charges out. So, I don't know, maybe he is still working for Disney. Maybe it does make sense. I don't really know. But it should be noted that allegedly the girls that he abused were from his own family. They were family members of his, and obviously they were minors. I guess we'll just never know the truth on this story.
Did this child help to solve her own murder? Nicole Koppler was 14 years old from Lima in Ohio. On the 19th of May 1999, she vanished. Her family was understandably very concerned, and this was only amplified when they made a sickening discovery. Up until her disappearance, it was revealed that she'd been spending time with a man called Glenn Fryer who had a criminal record. Disturbingly, this was for SAing a young girl. It would be an agonizing wait for Nicole's family before there were any developments in this case. And horrifically, it would take a 12-year-old girl to be attacked before any light was shone. In 2002, Glenn was charged with R-ing the girl in question. And police ended up searching his house and made a worrying discovery. They found Nicole's ID and her diary. The diary had a very unsettling entry in it, dated May the 24th, 1999. This was just 5 days after she vanished. She'd written in the diary entry that she had run away from home intentionally but did want to go back. She wrote in her diary that the people that she was staying with would not let her leave. Unsurprisingly, Glenn became the prime suspect in her disappearance. Police were actually working on a theory that maybe Glenn had taken her with the intent of human trafficking, and then potentially she could have resisted and he may have killed her by accident. He also may have killed her intentionally if she had resisted, as it was just too risky. Now, tragically, Glenn was never convicted of anything in relation to Nicole's case because just days after pleading no contest for the 2002 R, he took his own life in his police cell. It then wasn't until 2012 that Nicole's family could finally have some sort of closure in this case. Glenn's house taxes went unpaid and the house was abandoned for years. The council decided that it was unsightly and they needed to demolish the house, and as they did so, a discovery was made. The demolition team found human bones that were found to be Nicole's. Her family was finally able to put her to rest. This is the horrific case of Lee Rigby that stunned the UK. It was initially just a normal afternoon on the 22nd of May 2013. A British Army soldier, Lee Rigby, was off duty in London. He was walking down Wellington Street when a horrific tragedy would occur. At this point, Lee was just 25 years old. He was a well-respected drummer and machine gunner from Manchester and was engaged with a 2-year-old son. He was an avid supporter of the charity Help for Heroes. On the day in question, 2 men, Michael Adebelejo and Michael Adebowole, were in the area. Just before 2:20 p.m, they saw Lee crossing the road. The 2 men launched a brutal attack. They drove a Vauxhall Tigra at him, which knocked him over to the floor. They then exited the car and launched into an attack with knives and a cleaver. A member of the bus noticed an incident and jumped off, expecting to just give first aid. The person thought that it was just a road traffic collision. She got a horrific shock when she realised that Lee was actually deceased. While Lee was on the ground, she started engaging the attacker in a conversation and asking what on earth has happened. He started claiming responsibility for the attack and claimed that it was due to Lee being responsible for deaths of certain religious groups. A phone captured a video of one of the men stating his extremist propaganda to justify the attack. The attackers stayed at the scene while police were called. Both armed and unarmed police were deployed to the area, and as they arrived, the men charged at them. Armed police fired 8 times, wounding the men, and one of the men had his thumb shot off. Afterwards, it was revealed that both men were known to British security services. The day after the murder, 8 people were arrested in connection and 6 were freed on bail and 2 released without charge. Both killers were found guilty of murder, the eldest getting a whole life term without parole, and the youngest receiving just 45 years. The Lee Rigby Foundation was set up to support bereaved military families. Recently, Lee's son received a Pride of Britain award for his fundraising work for Scotty's little soldiers in memory of his dad.
This is Roman Polanski, a known Hollywood pedophile, ex-husband of Sharon Tate's, and a very famous film director. I'm going to warn you, this story has some very graphic details, so viewer discretion is advised. So if you don't know Roman Polanski's movies, he directed films like Rosemary's Baby, The Pianist, Chinatown, Oliver Twist. He has so many movies under his belt. But something that I didn't know about Roman Polanski is that his family lived in Poland during the Holocaust. His pregnant mother was murdered in a concentration camp, and he actually escaped by just running. Apparently, Roman had to roam the countryside for a long time searching for safety, and German soldiers would even play games with him, like making him dance around while they fired bullets at his feet. Roman Polanski began his film career directing movies in Poland before he moved to America. And it was in the year 1967 when he was making a movie about vampires when he met his future wife, Sharon Tate. They quickly fell in love and married. Roman Polanski got Sharon Tate pregnant, and she eventually would become the star of one of his biggest movies of all time, Rosemary's Baby. And if you know anything about true crime, then you probably know the end to this story. Sharon Tate was actually one of the victims of the Manson family, headed by Charles Manson. Roman was in London at the time when Sharon Tate was brutally murdered by members of the Manson family. She was pregnant with Roman Polanski's child. Obviously just a tragic story all around. But that still does not excuse what was to come. So obviously after Sharon Tate was murdered, he went through a very dark time in his life. But eventually he returned to the world of cinema with the film Chinatown, starring Jack Nicholson. And on March 11th, 1977, just 3 years after he had finished filming Chinatown, Roman Polanski was at Jack Nicholson's house. And it was at Jack Nicholson's house where Roman Polanski gave a minor, a 13-year-old girl, drugs, alcohol, and then proceeded to assault her. This is his actual mugshot after his arrest. Now, Roman Polanski was arrested almost immediately, and he actually ended up agreeing to a plea bargain where he would have 5 of the 6 charges completely dismissed. But upon hearing that the judge was not going to go with the plea bargain and they were going to sentence Roman to 50 years in prison, he fled the country. That's right, the day before his sentencing, Roman Polanski got on a flight to London, and he hasn't been able to step foot back in the United States ever since. In 2009, however, when Roman was in Switzerland, he was arrested at the request of United States authorities. They held him for a few months. Hollywood, for some reason, rallied around him and said he should be a free man. And then he was cut loose. Switzerland denied the extradition request. Now, even past all of this, keep in mind Roman Polanski has never actually served his time for this charge in America. Other people have come forward and claimed allegedly that Roman Polanski assaulted them when they were minors. There was a German actress who claimed that Polanski assaulted her when she was 15 in 1972, an American artist who claimed she was assaulted by Polanski in 1975 when she was only 10 years old. And there's just so much darkness that really surrounds this guy's character and the allegations around him. And if you want to hear something really disturbing, go look up Quentin Tarantino defending Roman Polanski and basically victim shaming the minor. That is something you can't unhear. What do you think? Should he be extradited back to the US?
This is the worst way somebody has ever died, and whatever you do, never look up the picture. This is Hisashi Ouchi, and he became the most radioactive man in history after a lab accident. On September 30th, 1999, the 34-year-old Hisashi and 2 other co-workers were working at the Takamura nuclear plant in Takamura, Japan, and they were put on an extremely tight deadline by their superiors. The plant converted uranium hexafluoride into enriched uranium for the purposes of nuclear energy. This usually involved a carefully timed multi-step process, but Hisashi and his co-workers attempted to take a shortcut to meet their deadlines, but this led to an horrific explosion of uranium solution that turned into a nightmare for Hisashi. The plant underwent emergency evacuation and the 3 men were immediately rushed to help. They all had been directly exposed to harmful radiation, but to different degrees. The sole survivor of the group was exposed to 3 sieverts of radiation. The second one was exposed to 10 sieverts of radiation. And Hisashi was exposed to a whopping 17 sieverts of radiation, which was more than any human in history. And by the time Hisashi arrived at the hospital, his body was already covered in burns, and his eyes were leaking blood, but his agony had just begun. 3 days after the accident, Hisashi was transferred to the University of Tokyo Hospital. Hisashi's lack of white blood cells and his non-existent immune response prompted experts to try a number of procedures to save him. Doctors tried countless skin grafts and blood transfusions, and even stem cell transplants, but sadly, none of these seemed to work. Hisachi soon cried out, "I can't take it anymore, I'm not a guinea pig," just after 1 week of treatment. But although Hisachi begged for his death, his family insisted that doctors kept him alive to keep trying experimental treatments. Hisachi's skin began to melt off his body, and even after this, his relatives ordered his doctors to do whatever it took to keep him alive. All in all, Hisachi was kept alive against his will for a disturbing 83 days. At one point, he suffered 3 heart attacks in 1 hour. Following the guidelines from his family, the doctors resurrected him again and again. Every time he died, he came back and suffered extreme brain damage. And on December 21st, 1999, Hisachi finally died of his last heart attack after multi-organ failure, and it was only then that his torture stopped. You really can't fathom the amount of pain this man was in until you see the photo of him. He doesn't even look human and kind of looks like an insect. The radiation poisoning is that bad, but I really don't recommend you look it up. But if you do, while you're looking at it, keep in mind he was kept alive for 83 days in that state. Could you honestly imagine what was going through his head and what his body was feeling?
What? Look in there, mate. Look in there. What? Look in there.
This is one of the worst true crime cases in history. This is the case of Sylvia Likens, who was a 16-year-old girl who, along with her younger sister Jenny, was left in the care of Jarud Benesweski by her parents. Jarud was a single mother with several children of her own. She agreed to take care of the Likens sisters in exchange for a small amount of money every week. The Liken parents were carnival workers and believed their daughters would be safe with Jarud. But that was far from the truth. Things took a horrific turn when Jarud and her children began to subject Sylvia to prolonged physical and emotional abuse. She was physically beaten, starved, and subjected to various forms of torture. Jarud's children and some neighborhood kids also participated in the abuse. Sylvia was kept locked in the basement where she endured unimaginable suffering. Jarud and the children not only beat Sylvia, but they also forced her to write degrading statements all over her own body, including phrases like, "I'm a prostitute and I'm proud of it." Sylvia was also burned with cigarettes, had her head shaved, and was often deprived of food and water. This abuse continued for months. On one occasion, as the family ate supper, Jarud, Paula, and a neighborhood boy named Randy force-fed Sylvia a hot dog overloaded with condiments, including mustard, ketchup, and spices. Sylvia vomited as a result and was later forced to eat her own vomit. On another occasion, Paula, who was Jarud's daughter, beat Sylvia in the face with such force that she broke her own wrist. Later, Paula used the cast on her wrist to further beat Sylvia. Jarud would also occasionally force Jenny, who was her younger sister, to strike her and beat her. And if she did not comply, they would just beat her. Several of Jarud's children's classmates frequently visited the house to both physically and verbally torment Sylvia. And with Jarud's active encouragement, these neighborhood children and her own routinely beat Sylvia, sometimes even using her as a practice dummy in violent judo sessions, also lacerating her body and burning her with lit cigarettes over 100 times. They also severely injured her genitals. To entertain Jarud and her teenage accomplices, Sylvia was forced at one point to strip naked in the family living room and masturbate with a glass Pepsi Cola bottle in their presence. And this was all for the enjoyment of this woman right here. And due to the increase in the frequency and the brutality of the torture and mistreatment of Sylvia, she gradually became incontinent, which is the uncontrolled leakage of urine. She was then denied any access to the bathroom, being forced to wet herself. And as a form of punishment, Jarud threw Sylvia into the basement and tied her up. Here, Sylvia was kept naked, rarely fed, and frequently deprived of water. Occasionally, she was tied to the railing of the basement stairs with her feet barely touching the ground. On October 25th, Sylvia attempted to escape from the basement after overhearing Jarud say they were just going to leave her to die in the basement. Sylvia attempted to flee to the front door, however, due to her extensive injuries and general weakness, Jarud caught her before she could escape the property. And on the morning of October 26, 1965, Sylvia Likens tragically succumbed to her injuries and died in the basement. Her cause of death was a combination of severe malnutrition, physical trauma, and the overall abuse she endured. Her body was found with numerous injuries including broken bones and extensive scarring, and the autopsy showed that there was more than 150 wounds across her body. Giroud was found guilty of first-degree murder and she was sentenced to life in prison. But somehow she was released in 1985 on parole, which is just sickening. She deserves to be underneath the prison. This is just absolutely horrifying. The Sylvia Likens case is a heartbreaking and disturbing true crime story that continues to captivate and horrify people to this day. There's a lot more I could talk about in this case, so if you want a part 2, let me know. Rest in peace to Sylvia Likens, and I can't believe this case.
This little girl was kidnapped in 2018 and has just been found. On the 25th of October 2018, 4-year-old Aranza Lopez was on a supervised visit with her biological mum. Her mum, Esmeralda, was being investigated over abuse allegations, so Aranza was actually in foster care at the time. It was arranged that the pair would have a supervised visit at a Washington shopping centre. However, during the visit, Esmeralda requested to take Aranza to the toilets and used the opportunity to snatch the little girl in a stolen vehicle. The FBI were notified and a huge search for Aranza and even advertised a $10,000 reward. It wasn't until a year later that Esmeralda was found and arrested, but there was still no sign of the little girl. That was until last month. She was recovered by Mexican authorities in February in western Mexico. In 2021, Esmeralda was actually extradited back to Washington state and pled guilty to second-degree kidnapping and robbery. She was sentenced to 20 months in prison. This woman screamed, "I don't want to die," as she was dragged to her death in a horrifying theme park incident. Kelty Byrne was a Canadian student, animal trainer and competitive swimmer. She was working at Sealand of the Pacific to earn extra money, and this involved being trained to work with orcas, otherwise known as killer whales. In controversial theme parks such as Sealand of the Pacific and SeaWorld, huge animals are either bred in captivity or traumatically captured and ripped apart from their families and natural habitats for humans' entertainment. On February the 20th, 1991, Kelty was working a shift and 3 whales were in one of the pools, including the infamous Tilikum. In a horrific turn of events, Kelty accidentally slipped and fell into the whale pool and attempted to grab onto the edge and save herself. However, before she could do so, she was grabbed by one of the whales that dragged her into the pool. The 3 whales then began throwing Kelty around, with many speculating that they may have simply thought this was a game. Others theorised that the whales were so traumatised and angered by their lives in tiny little pools that they took it out on Kelty. She was dragged under the water and then back up, screaming, "I don't want to die." After this horrific ordeal, she eventually drowned. It's reported that she was absolutely covered in bruises, was completely battered, and also covered in teeth marks. If I didn't know this was a true crime case, I would think it was a disturbing horror film. On the morning of the 7th of October 2022, a barefoot woman was running around Excelsior Springs, Missouri, bashing on people's doors. Witnesses describe her looking like she came straight from a horror film and she was calling for help. She'd been beaten, held captive, and SA'd for weeks. The woman was a shocking sight. She was covered in injuries and was wearing a bin bag. Disturbingly, she was gasping for breath as she had a very tight metal collar locked round her neck. It was a nurse who opened the door to her and let her come in. The nurse started to call police, and at this point the woman panicked. She warned her that the captor would kill her and claimed that he had killed her 2 friends. When police got there, the woman explained that a man called Timothy had captured her the month prior. He'd been holding her hostage this whole time. She said he'd been keeping her locked in the basement and had been SAing her. Disturbingly, she told police that he actually had a young son who lived at the house with him. When Timothy had taken his young son to school the one day, she used it as her opportunity to escape. Police made their way to the home of 39-year-old Timothy Hazlitt Jr. and found the property did in fact have a basement like the woman described. Timothy was arrested and is facing 9 charges, including first-degree kidnapping. He's being held on a $3 million bond and faces 5 life sentences. Before his arrest, police were actually called to his address 3 times. Twice they were asked to do welfare checks, and this was from an employer and also family members. Police have searched his home with cadaver dogs and they haven't yet released what they know.
However, coined the phrase, "You can't make this stuff up," might have known the story of real-life boogeyman, Albert Fish. A slight, elderly man with grey hair, no one suspected the kindly single father of being sadistic child murderer and cannibal.
I bet you didn't know that one of the biggest comedians and actors that played in some of your favorite shows was murdered. Phil Hartman was known for creating Pee-wee Playhouse. He was part of Saturday Night Live and voiced a few characters in The Simpsons. And Vice TV has put together season 2 of Dark Side of Comedy, which tells the story of one of the most loved comedians and actors in Hollywood. Phil had a rough childhood growing up, but that did not stop him from making people laugh and reaching so much success in his life. He was deeply loved by so many, especially the people who worked on set with him. But unfortunately, Phil's life began crumbling after his 3rd marriage, and everyone close to him began noticing. Vice TV put together an amazing glimpse of Phil's life from the beginning to when he was murdered by his wife. You can watch a new episode of Dark Side of Comedy on Tuesday at 10 p.m. Eastern on Vice TV.
This girl was...
I was killed by a gunshot to the head because of my reputation as the best rapper of my generation. My name is Jose Dwayne Ricardo Onfroy, and I am XXX Tentacion, also known as X, born on January 23, 1998 in Florida. My father left me at a very young age, so my mother struggled alone to provide for me. I grew up in poverty. At the age of 15, I started writing rap lyrics, discovering my passion. My music often drew inspiration from my life experiences and intense emotions. In 2017, my album 17 brought me fame. But my life was not just about success. I had legal troubles and was even incarcerated several times, but I worked hard to become a better person. Unfortunately, on June 18, 2018, at the age of 20, 2 masked men approached my car as I was leaving a motorcycle store, and one of them opened fire, leaving behind an unmatched style of music. My premature death in 2018 ended the possibility of seeing how my journey could have further evolved, and I leave behind my son who will never get to know his father.
If you've ever seen this man, you may be cursed. So around 2009, a man by the name of Jacob Fairchild was doing a human experiment in an old insane asylum. The experiment was to see if the subjects could stay awake for an entire month playing a computer game that he designed. But the people that were doing this experiment were not heard from afterwards. Jacob was apparently losing his mind while conducting this experiment. He started wearing a mask covered in eyes, calling himself the Timekeeper. This is an image that a former staff member had drawn of him. Eventually, legend has it, he went so crazy he locked everyone inside the facility and burned it down, killing everyone, including himself. But as the place was burning down, he threw himself over a computer server that had the game on it, and it was the only thing not damaged by the fire. Recently, it's been reported that the game Jacob created has been randomly resurfacing on people's computers. To this day, 2 of the teens that reported playing the game have died, 3 have gone missing, and 1 reported seeing this person upon starting the game. And no one who has ever played the game has won.
This is why you should never eat Pop Rocks again. There was a kid named Jimmy who loved the candy Pop Rocks as so much of us do. He ate them every single day and he was obsessed with every single flavor. One day, Jimmy ate a bunch of packs of Pop Rocks and mixed it with a bunch of soda. After doing this, he complained to his parents that his stomach hurt extremely bad, and they said it was most likely because you ate too much candy today. Jimmy then went to his room and the pain got even worse. He then tried to fall asleep to sleep the pain away. But about 30 minutes later, his parents heard a loud bang coming from his room. They then rushed upstairs and opened his bedroom door. And what they saw made them both scream in absolute horror. There was blood all over the room and Jimmy's body parts were spread out everywhere. They had no idea what happened, so they called doctors and investigators to come over and look at the scene. And they came to a very disturbing conclusion. Because of all the Pop Rocks that Jimmy ate and all the soda he mixed it with, it created a reaction in his stomach and caused his body to completely explode.
In 1912, a young boy went missing. And when he was finally reunited with his mother, it seemed like it was not the same boy. So 4-year-old Bobby Dunbar disappeared by a lake on a family vacation in 1912. The only clue found was his hat, which led many to believe he had been kidnapped. The next year, in 1913, a man is seen traveling with a boy that looks very similar to Bobby. He was arrested, but he insisted the boy was not Bobby. He was a boy named Bruce Anderson. But the police didn't listen and returned the boy to Bobby Dunbar's mother. At first, the mother is not convinced the boy is Bobby Dunbar. But she claims that the boy has similar birthmarks to Bobby, so it must be the same child. But when she sends him to play with the neighborhood kids, they don't recognize Bobby either. The boy lived with the Dunbars for the rest of his life, went on to have a family of his own, and passed away in 1966. And almost 100 years after this took place, Bobby Dunbar's granddaughters insisted a DNA test be done. And it proved what they feared to be true. The boy was Bruce Anderson. He shared no DNA with the Dunbar family. It turns out part of the reason he was not reunited with his real mother was there was a rumor that Bruce Anderson's mother was a prostitute and was not viewed favorably by the police. For more creepy history, make sure you're following along.
This woman reported her ex to police, and less than an hour later she was dead. Fridoline Daniel was a 34-year-old mother from Florida. On the 8th of November 2023, she filed a police report against her ex. Her ex was Robens Caesar, aged 41. She told police how he had been harassing her. Her family state that on the Wednesday morning when she was dropping her daughter off at school, he had been following her. She did exactly what anyone would have advised. She went straight to the police station and reported this. Less than an hour later, though, the unthinkable happened. As Fridoline arrived back at her apartment complex just prior to 9 a.m., her ex was waiting for her. Fridoline was actually with her aunt at this point, and her aunt heard her say, "Oh, did you bring a gun to kill me?" Neighbours heard loud gunshots, and when police arrived, they found the woman deceased. Her ex's black Honda was seen leaving the area by witnesses. He then allegedly confessed to police. He reportedly said that the pair had split up and she was refusing to get back with him. He allegedly told police that her reporting him to the police was the final straw. He is now obviously facing a first-degree murder charge.
This is how it ends for us. The last words that Heather Wood heard on the phone with her estranged husband Christopher before he shot their daughter Ava before turning the gun on himself. Heather and Christopher were separated at the time and not living together. They'd previously had 2 incidents that involved the police, one for stalking and one for aggravated harassment. The couple's 14-year-old daughter Ava was an avid soccer player. She absolutely loved her friends and was described by teachers as an all-round athlete. She was an honest student and the teachers loved having her in class. On January 19th, 2023, Ava was staying at her dad's, but Heather had received a worrying phone call. Christopher had previously shown signs of depression, and he said on the phone, "This is how it ends for us." She never for 1 second imagined that Christopher would hurt Ava, but when Ava didn't show up for school the next day, Heather phoned 911 and asked them to do a welfare check. Ava and Christopher were both found in separate rooms in the house, with gunshot wounds to their heads. Christopher's was self-inflicted. Ava's family and friends and everybody in the community has obviously been left absolutely shocked and heartbroken. Ava's death was senseless and completely unnecessary.
I went ghost hunting on the Titanic and it was terrifying. Well, technically I didn't actually go down to the wreck of the Titanic, but I did go to the Titanic Museum in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. Inside of the museum, they have hundreds of objects recovered from the wreck of the Titanic, and they've recreated parts of the ship. So while I was inside of the museum, I asked one of the workers if she's ever experienced anything paranormal. And she told me that people see all sorts of entities within the museum. They see the spirits of a little boy, they see an evil-looking man in one of the areas, and they even see a headless woman. Now, the assumption is that these spirits come from the objects that were recovered from the wreck of the Titanic. Here are a couple highlights of the evidence that I captured. At one point, I got the words "can't breathe" on one of my devices, which obviously led me to believe that it might have been somebody who drowned during the wreck. In another room, I also got the name Raymond. And when I Googled Raymond the Titanic, there were actually 2 passengers named Raymond that were on board. Sadly, one of the Raymonds made it out alive, and the other died with the ship. The museum has a seriously spooky atmosphere throughout. It almost reminded me of an old haunted house attraction with the way some of the rooms were designed. But while I was there in the museum, I made connection with so many other spirits. It's such a crazy video. If you want to watch it, it's on YouTube right here. Just look up my channel, The Paranormal Files. And I'm also going to put the link to the video in the bio of my TikTok.
This is the youngest ever death row inmate, Krista Pike. When she was just 18 years old, Krista became jealous of a fellow classmate that she thought was trying to steal her boyfriend Tadaryl Shipp. Along with Tadaryl and her friend Shadola Peterson, she came up with a plan to lure this girl to an abandoned steam plant near their university campus. They told Colleen Slemmer to meet them there as they wanted to make peace and offer her some drugs. When she arrived, Krista and her boyfriend attacked Colleen while Shadola kept lookout. For 30 horrific minutes, Colleen was tortured, taunted, and beaten, and Krista actually carved a pentagram in her chest while she was still alive. Finally, Krista picked up a piece of asphalt from the ground and smashed it down over Colleen's head, killing her. She then kept a piece of Colleen's skull and was apparently showing it off at school the next day. Within 36 hours, Krista, Tadaryl, and Shadola were all arrested. Their university logbook showed that they left with Colleen, but returned without her, and the piece of skull that Krista kept was found in her jacket pocket. Krista soon confessed, but she said that they hadn't intended on killing Colleen, and that they just wanted to scare her, but it got out of control. Krista was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, and she was found guilty on both counts. On March 30th, 1996, she was sentenced to death by electrocution. Tadaryl received a life sentence with the possibility of parole, and Shadola received probation for pleading guilty to being an accessory after the fact. Krista is now 47 and is still on death row in Tennessee, awaiting execution.
Following a horrific viral video, this woman was murdered. Transgender woman Malaysia Booker was just 22 when she was killed. Her horrific death occurred on the 18th of May 2019. Police were called to an incident on Valley Glen Drive in northeastern Dallas at around 6:40 a.m. They found the victim lying face down, deceased from homicidal violence. She didn't have any ID with her at the time, so she was identified the next day. Now, the victim had actually gone viral the month prior as part of a horrific video circulating on the internet. She was violently attacked by a group of males in the car park of an apartment complex on April the 12th, 2019. Now, the incident started with something fairly minor. Malaysia was accused of reversing into somebody's car. She was viciously attacked and a crowd gathered, and rather than get the woman the help that she needed, they started videoing. The video started circulating on social media, and Malaysia suffered from concussion and a fractured wrist. Now, Edward Thomas, the man who attacked her, was charged with aggravated assault and held in Dallas County Jail. He was actually convicted of a lesser charge later on of misdemeanor assault and given 300 days in prison. After surviving the attack, Malaysia spoke out about violence against the transgender community. Just a month later, she was dead. After she was found deceased from a gunshot wound, Kendrell Lyles was arrested and charged with her murder, as well as 2 other killings. Police stated that Malaysia was seen getting into a light-coloured Lincoln, matching the description of Kendrell's car. Police also examined phone records which showed he was in the area at the time. He's been sentenced to 48 years for that killing. Shockingly, he's also charged with shooting Letitia Grant, aged 35, just 4 days after Malaysia's murder. He's also charged with killing Kenneth Kichoki the day after.
This man, Ronnie McNutt, went on Facebook Live and live streamed his own death. So this is Ronnie McNutt. And on August 31st, 2020, this 33-year-old started a Facebook live stream. Now, Ronnie was a military veteran. He had served time in the United States Army Reserve and had spent time in Iraq. At the time of his death, Ronnie actually worked at a Toyota plant in Mississippi, but he suffered from a number of mental health conditions like depression and PTSD. The PTSD being a direct consequence of his time served in Iraq. So shortly before his death, Ronnie had broken up with his girlfriend, which caused him to spiral. And it was a combination of all these mental health disorders and recent events in the world that led Ronnie to start that stream. So at the beginning, the stream seemed pretty normal, and one friend named Joshua Steen joined in to see what Ronnie was up to. But he became alarmed when he noticed that Ronnie was visibly intoxicated and holding a gun. So during this stream, multiple people tried to reach out to Facebook to get them to cut off the stream. But it wasn't until hours after Ronnie had taken his own life when Facebook responded with this callous message, stating they had worked with experts to figure out how to best help Ronnie and that the post would remain on Facebook, even though it depicted the gruesome death of Ronnie. So in the stream, everybody's talking to Ronnie, trying to convince him to not do what he's about to do, but at one point he receives a phone call from his ex-girlfriend. They argued over the phone, then she ended the call on Ronnie, and that's when he looked at the audience that was watching on Facebook, said, "Hey guys, I guess that's it," aimed his rifle under his chin and took his own life. Now the police had already been called and were at Ronnie's apartment, but for some reason they had waited until they heard the gunshot to enter his home. And tragically, immediately after Ronnie took his life, his phone started buzzing, people were calling him, and as officers searched his home, his phone continued to ring. A final message that Ronnie had left people on Facebook was discovered after his death, and it read, "Someone in your life needs to know that they matter, that they are loved, that they have a future. Be the one to tell them." In a really disturbing twist though, users actually screen recorded the video and started uploading it to all sorts of social media platforms. And it kept popping up everywhere on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and yes, on TikTok. And all these platforms were very slow to remove the videos. Literally only a few days after Ronnie took his own life, the hashtag Ronnie McNutt had over 15.6 million views here on TikTok. And I have to say, the people that were uploading these videos trying to expose people to this horrific material are disgusting. This is a really tragic, sad story, and I hope that Ronnie is in a better place now.
What? Look in there, mate. Look in there. What? Look in there.
When officers arrived at this crime scene, they noticed something odd. A camera crew arrived to film a true crime series, and some said nothing looked like it should have looked. Victoria Rickman was a 30-year-old divorced mother. She was in a relationship with Will Carter Jr., who was also 30. The pair were said to have been in a couple for around 3 years, and they both had children. Victoria had a son and Will had a daughter. Now, things between the pair were extremely volatile. However, it was the 13th of September 2013 when things turned extremely dark. Police received a frantic phone call in the early hours of the morning, and it was Victoria. Shockingly, she told police that she had killed her partner. She told them that he had been SAing her and she was left with no choice but to shoot him to get him off. This was actually not the first time that Victoria claimed that Will had assaulted her. She told friends and family of disturbing events when Will had apparently arred her and abused her. However, Will's family had an entirely opposite narrative. Will had opened up to his friends and family about Victoria's abuse. She'd reportedly threatened and physically assaulted him on numerous occasions. Will's dad told detectives that on one occasion a year prior, Will had showed up to his dad's house bleeding. Victoria had apparently hit him in the head with a hammer and bit him. Will's dad recalled saying to Will, "If she'd had a gun, she'd have killed you." As well as this, 4 months prior to Will's death, Victoria was actually arrested and charged with battery. These charges were pending at the time of Will's killing. When police showed up to the crime scene on the 13th of September, they noticed something very odd. There were no signs of a struggle at all. After the picture had been painted of a vicious assault and a self-defense shooting, officers expected multiple injuries on both parties. Will's gunshot wounds were the only wounds he had. There were no signs of a fight, and tellingly, police stated it seemed that Will was not even facing her when she shot him. Police did not buy Victoria's claims of self-defense, and they arrested her and charged her with Will's murder. Interestingly, video cameras from a reality true crime series were filming as events unfolded. Investigators looked into some forensics from the scene. They noted that there was blood spatter on the back wall and it was quite high up. This indicated that the victim had to have been standing up. Very interestingly, the gun that Victoria had actually used was given to her by a law enforcement officer. The officer, Rick Price, had given this to her a few months prior to the killing. She'd apparently told him that she was afraid and he gave her one of his personal guns. He even apparently took her to a gun shooting range to practice. He did admit that he was romantically interested in Victoria at this time. Eventually, Victoria was given life without parole for the murder.
These are missing person cases you probably never heard of. This is Yelena Carisi, born July 26, 1970. She was touring Central America and North America when she arrived in New Orleans, Louisiana in 1993. She had gone with her parents on a trip to the city, then decided to stay after the vacation was over and her parents returned to Italy. At first, she traveled to Florida, left a few days later after telling her parents she feared two men in Florida who were trying to drug her and kill her. She then traveled to Belize and Mexico before going back to New Orleans. Yelena, who speaks fluent English, immersed herself in the street culture there and kept company with street musicians and homeless people. She painted and took notes about the people she met, stating she planned to write a book, possibly a novel about her experiences. Her father believes she may have been using drugs during this period. At the time of her disappearance, Yelena was staying in the Ladale, a cheap hotel on the 700th block of St. Charles Avenue, 5 blocks from the French Quarter, with Alexander Muscala, a street musician who was 54 and performed in several countries in Europe. She checked in on December 31st, the week before she disappeared. Alexander said they slept in separate beds during the time they shared the hotel room, and she refused any sexual relationship with him in spite of his urgings. He had a history of drug use and sexual violence, as well as a reputation as a guru. Yelena seemed fascinated by him. She referred to him as my master and said he had opened completely new intellectual horizons for her. Yelena was last seen in the city's French Quarter area on January 6, 1994. Her parents, who last heard from her on New Year's Day, reported her missing on January 18th. They traveled to Louisiana shortly afterwards to assist in the search efforts. No evidence regarding Yelena's whereabouts was discovered. Most of her personal belongings, including her passport, backpack, clothing, camera, luggage, and notebooks, were left behind at the hotel, which is just weird. Alexander showed Yelena's passport to the hotel staff after her disappearance and attempted to use the traveler's checks to pay for the bill for their room. But the checks were refused because they weren't signed and he was evicted. He told the police he did not know Yelena's whereabouts but believed she was alright. He was arrested on January 31st after a former girlfriend claimed he had raped her, but was released for lack of evidence after less than 2 weeks. The only possible lead was a security guard who said he saw a woman jump into the Mississippi River at 11:30 p.m. on January 6th, the last day she was seen. Prior to jumping, the woman was acting strangely and said, "I belong in the water." She swam for about 100 yards and began to struggle against the current and the wake from a passing boat, then screamed for help and sank. She fit Yelena's general physical description and was wearing similar clothes, but they weren't identical. It has never been established that that person was in fact Yelena, but many authorities in New Orleans believe it was her. Not everyone believes Yelena is dead, however. No trace of her remains were found in the river, but it's possible she was washed into the Gulf of Mexico and out to sea. Since January 1994, there has been many reported sightings of her in the United States, and even Italy and some places in Europe, even more than a decade after her disappearance. None of the sightings have been confirmed, and Yelena continues to be listed as a missing person.
This schoolboy stabbed his teacher to death in front of a classroom full of students. 61-year-old Anne Maguire was a Spanish teacher teaching in Leeds. She'd actually worked at the school for 40 years and she was only 5 months off retirement. However, in April 2014, something absolutely horrific happened. One of her students was 15-year-old Will Cornick. He'd always been described as a smart student who never really caused any trouble. Classmates regarded him as a polite student, but after he got diagnosed with diabetes, his personality seemed to change. In 2013, he tried to join the army, but because of his diagnosis, he was rejected. Being in the army had been his dream, so this was really upsetting for him. After failing to complete his Spanish homework, he was given detention by Anne. He also expressed a wish to her that he wanted to drop Spanish, but she wouldn't let him, which only angered him more. He began to develop a deep-rooted grudge against Anne. Shockingly, he reportedly messaged his friends on Facebook asking if one of them would kill her for him for £10. During one school day, halfway through his Spanish class, Will decided to get up and attack Anne with a knife. The classmates watched on in horror as he chased her out of the classroom. When there, another teacher heard her screams and tried to shield Anne from any more blows from him. Will then allegedly returned to his class and told his classmates how it was a shame that he hadn't killed her. However, Anne did actually pass away from her injuries. Will later admitted that he did plan also to kill 2 other teachers. One of them was actually pregnant at the time. He's been sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 20 years. This is the disturbing case of the child who killed a child. In July 2018, 6-year-old Alicia McPhail was abducted from her bed. She'd been staying with her grandparents in the Isle of Bute. She'd gone to sleep watching Peppa Pig, and no one had any idea of the horrors that would unfold that evening. Meanwhile, 16-year-old Aaron Campbell was drinking with friends at his house. Aaron apparently became upset in the night because he had been arguing with his mum. He had had a challenging upbringing involving physical and emotional abuse. Aaron decided that evening he wanted to get some substances to smoke from a couple that he knew. The couple in question were Alicia's dad, Robert, and his girlfriend. They'd been known to sell substances to Aaron previously, but he could not get hold of them. Intending to go and steal them off them, Aaron armed himself with a knife. He headed to Robert's house where he lived with his parents and girlfriend. This was obviously where Alicia was staying that evening. When he arrived at the house, he noticed the 6-year-old sleeping in her bed and took the opportunity to snatch the poor defenseless young child. Disgustingly, he carried her to a secluded location, SA'd her, and then killed her. He then disposed of his clothes in the sea. At 6 a.m. the next day, Alicia's grandparents woke up to discover that the little girl was missing. They straight away alerted police and locals. When the family asked Aaron to keep an eye out for the little girl, he texted them back saying, "Oh damn, I'm sure she's not went too far." A local man soon discovered Alicia's lifeless body around 15 minutes away from her house. Along with a lot of the local community, Aaron's mum actually checked her CCTV of her house. She was hoping that this would help with the investigation, and it definitely did. She saw her son leaving and returning from the house that night, and she handed the evidence over to police. Aaron was arrested, and it was discovered that the clothes that he'd abandoned on the beach did actually match with his DNA. This case made me terrified to go to the cinema. This is the case of the horror in Screen 9. James Holmes was raised in California. His mum was a nurse and his dad was a scientist. From a young age, he was experiencing night terrors and allegedly actually tried to take his own life when he was just 11 years old. He was apparently obsessed with guns and weapons and had dreamed of becoming a mass murderer. Between May and July 2012, he legally bought 4 guns. Background checks were conducted and he was allowed the weapons. He also bought spike strips, which, if you don't know, pop the tyres of cars if they chase after you. On July the 19th, just hours before tragedy would unfold, James mailed his notebook to his psychiatrist. Inside the notebook, James detailed his plans to kill. The notebook was actually discovered later on undelivered. Just prior to entering a cinema in Aurora, James rang a crisis line to tell them about his plans to kill. However, the call was disconnected after just 9 seconds. At the midnight showing of The Dark Knight Rises, CCTV captures James walking into the cinema. He walks into Screen 9, props open the door, and then walks back out again. Shockingly, he goes to his car and gets guns out and gas canisters. He re-entered the screen at about 12:38 p.m. and set off 2 gas canisters. When he entered Screen 9 again, he immediately opens fire on the audience, instantly killing 10 people. 2 others later died in hospital from their injuries. An additional 70 people were injured. This was an absolutely packed out cinema. James also shot at people as they scrambled to exit the screen. His youngest victim was a 6-year-old girl. Witnesses said this all unfolded as there was actually a gunfight on the screen, and initially they all thought it was special effects and just part of the film. Police were actually on the scene very quickly after the first 911 call. James surrendered to the police and was arrested in the car park. He was apparently very calm when he was arrested and told police that he had booby-trapped his apartment. When police investigated his apartment, this was found out to be true. He was sentenced to 12 consecutive life sentences.